It seemed like the perfect plan. They did the right thing. But then, things got horribly wrong. So why is it that besides the Bolt, GM barely sells any EVs? And why on earth is GM taking government loans and subsidies and funneling them straight into shareholder and management pockets? I set to find out. Hey guys, welcome to Connecting the Dots, the channel where we try to predict where disruptions will take us. I love Tesla, but I'm a GM fan at heart. Part of it is from my childhood, when my dad owned a 2-ton Chevrolet El Camino he converted into a 6-seater. It stuck out like a sore thumb among the small European and Japanese cars around, and it drank gas like there's no tomorrow. But my dad loved it, and from the back seat, so did I. But the main reason I loved GM was their engineering. Don't laugh, because GM had some kick-ass engineers at the time.
I'm dying. When I saw this casting that's part of the front fender at the New York show, my jaw dropped. I'd never seen anything like this on a car before. So why don't we start with that, because I'm blown away by this.
Yeah.
They could do wonders, and it's not their fault that their 2-bit management preferred to sell fossils and killed anything innovative if it cost 2 cents above last decade's tech. I still have a warm spot for GM, and I do want them to succeed. So following my series on how GM sold America, I decided to take a fresh look at GM's EV plans. The video consists of 2 parts. The first part analyzes GM's EV plans and tries to determine whether, despite currently lagging, GM has a chance of passing other OEMs. But the second part takes a more somber view on GM, as it tries to answer why GM is taking government loans and subsidies and funneling them into shareholders' pockets. Yes, you heard that right. Because similar to what it did in the years preceding the big bailout, GM's one hand is taking taxpayer dollars to help face the challenges awaiting down the road to electrification, while GM's other hand is quietly passing this funding on to shareholders. And the funny thing is that nobody's talking about it. I created this video at the request of my producer-level patron, Katrin. Patrons make this channel possible, so a big shout out to my latest patrons, Ludwig N., Dale T., and Quinn. Thank you for supporting the channel. Now buckle up and get ready, because we'll see a company which could not handle disruption, and disruption is never boring. Part 1. GM's EV Plan. Prologue. Leapfrogging the competition. Ford built its Mach-E on an ICE platform. VW did the same with their ID series. BMW did this with their I-Series, and so did almost every Western OEM. For future EVs, both Ford and VW are working on dedicated EV platforms like the ones Tesla uses, but GM was smarter and did this right from the start. But Ultium isn't just dedicated. It was designed with modularity in mind. For small cars, just remove a module or 2 and shorten the wheelbase. For large cars, extend the wheelbase and add battery modules. And if you really want range, you can even add an extra layer of batteries on top of the regular one. Easy. This enabled GM to attack several car segments at once, with plans to launch numerous models ranging from the smaller Chevy Equinox to the mammoth Cadillac Escalade and Hummer EV. They even wanted to make a Ultium-based Nikola Badger. The list is immense and too long to read, so just look at the screen to get your mind blown. If you ask GM, they did everything right. With their Ultium dedicated platform, they leapfrogged other OEMs by several years. They one-upped Tesla by making Ultium modular to enable different models. They made it flexible and capable of accepting pouch cells, prismatic cells, and cylindrical. They made it chemistry agnostic, ready to take anything from nickel-based batteries to LFP. They planned many models based on it, some of which are really cool. They struck deals for battery factories. They even took care of raw materials. It seems like all they need to do now is crank the production lever to 11 and start spitting out cars in all market segments. Only they aren't. So why isn't GM challenging Tesla in sales? Forget Tesla. Why is it that in the last 4 quarters, they only sold 2,440 Cadillac Lyrics and 903 Hummer EVs? That's half the number of E-Transits Ford made, let alone Mustang Mach-E's and F-150 Lightning EVs. And why are they raising prices before the vehicles are even launched? In other words, what went wrong? Chapter 1. Planning is overrated. GM devised an excellent plan, and that's exactly the problem. They approached EVs just like any other project, by making detailed plans, setting multi-year budgets, and thinking everything to a T before starting their EV journey. But EVs are a disruption, which makes them a whirlwind of rapidly changing technologies, requirements, and market conditions that wait for nobody. Disruptions should be approached hungry and howling, embracing change with an agile mindset and a willingness to take risks. It's like SpaceX launching test rockets, knowing they'll blow up. You try, you fail, and you learn. You try again and learn even more. Failing fast teaches valuable lessons fast, and that's how progress is made. That's my opinion, but GM thought otherwise. They approached EVs with old-school professionalism. They planned, erased, honed, and fixed, and while they were planning to win the Olympics, others jumped into the water and improved their swimming. Ford's Team Edison quickly hodgepodged the Mach-E. And sure, it got clobbered by Sandy Munro for its messy cooling system. And sure, they lose money producing them. But the valuable lessons they learned made the F-150 Lightning much better and will make their upcoming EV platform better yet. Ford learned to make EVs and to manage their batteries. They learned to work with new suppliers and to ramp up production lines. They climbed up the learning curve and slid down on costs. They learned their strengths and their weaknesses. They learned which people they need, not those they think they'll need. And they even learned to reorganize the company to let their EV business grow. Ford's willingness to rush things despite losing money taught them lessons which GM has yet to learn, while GM's risk-averse approach lost them precious time. Chapter 2. Sharpening the Axe. Some viewers might wonder what happened to the importance of sharpening the axe. If planning enables GM to enter the market a generation ahead of other OEMs, isn't that a smart thing to do? Lengthy planning is great, but extremely risky in times of disruption. Technology changes so fast that by the time your axe is optimally sharp for cutting trees, chainsaws arrive and your axe is made obsolete. When technology is changing fast, cycle times must be kept short and agility is king. So sometimes you have to embrace Nike's motto and just do it. In GM's case, this was amplified by their unwillingness to settle for a bird in the hand and aiming for a dozen on the tree. Instead of launching a single model and continuously improving it and learning before making a better, cheaper second model, GM wanted to plan an entire lineup right from the start. This introduced further delays, and since new technologies are constantly evolving, this locked GM's entire lineup onto outdated technology. Tesla recently revealed their unboxed method of making EVs, which should revolutionize the industry. Toyota hurriedly showed an unboxed concept, promising that their next-generation EVs will be built the Tesla way. Chinese manufacturers surely took notes, and there's at least a chance that Ford and other companies will adopt this method somewhere down the road. But General Motors has an entire lineup planned and locked into obsolescence, so there's little chance of them moving to the cheaper unboxed method for several years. But Ultium was obsolete, long before the unboxed revolution was unveiled. For example,
the crown jewel of the Ultium system is the battery cell itself, where our strategy is to use the fewest number of the largest cells possible. These cells are then packaged into modules. This system is a simple, lightweight, and a space-efficient solution, which enables us to optimize the battery energy storage and the layout for each vehicle design.
Fearing bad cells, GM made Ultium take up 24 separate modules. This helps repairability because if a cell goes bad, you only need to replace one module instead of the entire pack. However, cell quality is now high enough that bad cells stopped being an issue, and the world is shifting to cell-to-pack designs with sealed pack reliability like iPhones have. This might not seem like a big deal because other OEMs don't have it yet either. However, the next model that other OEMs design, or the one after that, probably will, while GM's entire lineup will use less reliable, outdated tech for years to come. The hardware for modules adds weight, which reduces the range or requires more batteries, which raise costs and make the cars heavier yet. It also takes space, which reduces the pack's energy density to give less range or require an even bigger and heavier pack. But GM's problems go way beyond modularity. For example, while GM planned their cars for powerful but expensive nickel-based batteries, LFP became the hottest thing. Ultium can use LFP, no problem with that, but designing the entire lineup around nickel-based chemistries means that not all models will be able to use LFP, and those that will be non-optimized, which means they'll be heavier, more expensive, and with less range compared to what they could have been had GM planned for LFP from the get-go. A big thank you to today's sponsor, Magic Spoon. As a kid, I loved eating cereal, but as I got older, I started eating healthier and realized that it no longer fits my lifestyle. That's why I was extremely surprised to discover Magic Spoon. Magic Spoon took a first principles approach and they reinvented cereal. In a way, it's like Cybertruck, as instead of copying others and making just another also-ran, they developed a cereal that has it all and tastes great despite having zero sugar and no artificial ingredients. Magic Spoon provides a healthier alternative for breakfast, but I found myself also taking them as a snack. They have 0 grams of sugar, each serving has up to 14 grams of protein, with only 140 calories and 4 net grams of carbs. And if that's not enough, they're keto-friendly, gluten-free, grain-free, and soy-free as well. For me, Magic Spoon combines the joys of childhood with my more discerning grown-up taste. The fruity flavor brings back childhood memories with the sweetness dialed right for today. And I just love the cocoa flavor, which is sweet but has that slight bitterness that only real cocoa provides. Magic Spoon is so confident that they'll be your new favorite cereal that they give a 100% happiness guarantee, so that if you don't like it, just send it back for a no questions asked full refund. Go to magicspoon.com/CTDots and enter the code CTDots for $5 off your order. Chapter 3. Goodness gracious, great bolts of fire. LFP batteries are much safer than nickel-based, which brings us to another huge fault. In 2019, after Chevy bolts started catching fire, GM and LG analyzed the problem and determined it was caused by torn anode tabs. GM recalled all cars made from 2017 onward and replaced their battery packs. In 2021, after fires started appearing in cars with the newer packs, GM and LG investigated further and eventually discovered a second defect, a folded separator. Once again, GM replaced the packs in all affected cars. What GM didn't realize was that it's not the defects dummy, it's the entire cell design. Imperfections and variations, sometimes measuring fractions of a millimeter, are relatively common in battery manufacturing, so the battery design must be resilient enough to accommodate some imperfections without catastrophic failure. Bolts used pouch cells, which are most susceptible to such problems, and since GM failed to realize that the entire format was at fault, they started building with LG 3 pouch cell factories to supply their entire Ultium-based range of cars. What's more, in their Ultium presentation, they looked down on cylindrical cells, saying, "Fact, unlike traditional cylindrical battery cells, our high-energy pouch cells have a modular design, and Ultium's long pouch cells waste less space and can stack on top of each other like pancakes, or vertically like slices of toast." I'm not sure toast is a word they'd use now that they have experience with bolts burnt to a crisp. Now that they'd realized the problem, they backpedaled. They canceled plans for a 4th pouch cell factory with LG and started building with Samsung a new factory to make cylindrical cells they previously sneered at. However, they still have the overhead of 3 pouch cell factories they're reluctant to use, and until the new plant is ramped up, all they will have is pouch. This could also explain GM's low production numbers. GM may have realized that until cylindrical cells arrive, the more EVs they sell, the more likely it is that the flaming Bolt fiasco will repeat, only this time with their Ultium models. Having Ultium EVs burst into flames, just like Bolts did, would just about kill their EV program. Not to mention they'll need to replace every Ultium EV they have sold. So until cylindricals are available, the fewer EVs they sell, the better. Chapter 4. Lacking basic knowledge. And worst of all, GM lacks even basic EV know-how. When making the Bolt, LG supplied the EV tech, while GM supplied the conventional car stuff, such as chassis and body. As a result, GM is so new to making EVs that they blunder even on basics. For example, consider the following story, leaked to me by a source close to GM's EV program. When GM road tested the US version of the Lyriq, they had 2 fires, which started at the charging ports. Following the second fire, they sent the car to the supplier of the charging port to find the cause. I don't know how the supplier answered them, but the bottom line was, "I told you so." The charging inlet used V2 plastic, which is mildly flame retardant, but leaves drops of flammable plastic. This means that if moisture while charging causes an electrical arc, this could start a fire. The supplier originally recommended using V0 plastic, but GM saved on pennies and decided to use V2. Don't get me wrong. Fires like this can happen when developing new cars. For example, Lordstown Motors pickup caught fire on its first test drive, and that's fine. But knowing that high-voltage charging ports should be made from flame-retardant plastic is basic, especially when pointed out by the vendor. Not doing so is forgivable with someone new to EVs, like Lordstown Motors was, but not what you'd expect from a company getting ready to mass-produce 20 models in the next few years. I have a feeling that GM finally realized that making EVs is not as simple as they expected, and that mass-producing cars at this stage could be a flaming fiasco. Another example that GM are newbies at making EVs is worker safety. When Tesla was new to making EVs, the worker safety organization WorkSafe found that Tesla factory workers were injured at a rate 31% higher than the industry average. Fast forward to 2021, however, and Tesla's injury rate dropped to 10% lower than average. Back to GM, and its Ultium plants have alarmingly high injury rates, with incidents such as workers getting sprayed in the face with toxic electrolyte, toxic gas bursting into work areas, and more. With experience, they'll lower injury rates, but current safety is at a worse place than Tesla was 8 years ago. Chapter 5. Does GM stand a chance? GM currently sells very few EVs, and disregarding the Bolt, that's next to nothing. Yet they constantly say that they will soon pass all other automakers. Passing Tesla is hype, but do they stand a chance of passing other OEMs? Excluding Tesla and the Chinese, and comparing only to OEMs, I gotta say yes, there is a chance of GM blasting past them, but only because the bar that OEMs set is very low. Sure, they have a problem with pouch cells, and sure, Ultium isn't as efficient as GM imagined it would be, but it's not like other OEMs are zooming ahead. Most OEMs currently sell very few EVs, so are easy targets to overtake. They are all using first-gen platforms derived from ICE cars and have yet to develop dedicated EV-only platforms. For example, VW is currently working on its Ultium lookalike scalable systems platform, so 2 years from now, VW will start making technology as obsolete as Ultium currently is. A few automakers will possibly cut straight to building cars through an unboxed process, but most won't. So while GM won't catch Tesla or the Chinese, if they crank their urgency level up to 11, iron out bugs, get enough batteries, and ramp up fast, that's a huge if because mass production is hard. But if they do it, they do have a chance of scaling up to one of the top OEM positions. Only they won't. And to see why, let's go to the second part of this video. Part 2. Preparing for Bailout. In the years leading to the 2008 bankruptcy and the ensuing bailout, GM funneled out to its shareholders over $36 billion in dividends and share buybacks. Had they kept some of this cash or used it to lower GM's looming debt, there's a good chance that GM could have avoided bankruptcy or at least lowered the burden that American taxpayers had to pay. Of course, this didn't happen. General Motors gave these billions away, and the rest is history. Fast forward to today, and GM is taking even more loans. Yet once again, instead of keeping money in the war chest or investing heavily in electrification, they are siphoning the cash from these loans straight to shareholders' pockets. So what gives? Part 2, Chapter 1, Agency Problem. As usual with GM, the reason they won't make more EVs is crappy management, and it all starts with agency problem. Agency problem is a conflict of interest where one party is expected to act in the best interest of another, but instead of doing so, they prioritize their own interests over those of the principals. In other words, if the CEO's or board's interests are not aligned with those of other shareholders, they might steer the ship in directions that are good for them, but not for shareholders. To check how the interests of GM's management are aligned with those of shareholders, let's do a quick comparison between GM's CEO compensation with that of Tesla. Tesla's CEO, Elon Musk, is its largest private shareholder, and his recent payment plan was unique. He received no salary at all, and his entire payment was tied to achieving extremely ambitious goals requiring huge growth. Since management should only focus on long-term company performance, Elon's incentive structure was extremely well aligned with shareholder interests. Elon charged ahead. Tesla grew from making 1,500 EVs in 2010 to around 1.8 million in 2023, and the company's valuation grew to 460 times the valuation at the 2010 IPO. Expecting huge growth, Elon acted as a shareholder. He held to his shares, and for the first 10 years since the IPO, he didn't sell a single share. Like Elon, General Motors CEO Mary Barra is GM's largest private shareholder. In addition, a mere 7.2% of her 2022 compensation was paid as salary. So far, so good. But that's where the similarities end. 21.6% of Barra's compensation was given as a bonus for GM's performance in 2021, as measured via A, financial performance, and B, strategic goals. While tying compensation to performance sounds great, in GM's case, the CEO bonus tremendously incentivized making fewer EVs. Let's start with A, financial performance, where the bonus was paid for GM's earnings per share exceeding the company's target EPS by 14%. We don't know how much GM loses on its newer EVs, but Ford has more transparency, and analysts estimate they lose tens of thousands of dollars per vehicle. So for a rough estimate, let's assume GM would lose $10,000 to $20,000 per car. If so, then had GM produced, for example, 500,000 Ultium EVs in 2022, that would have knocked $5 to $10 billion off its earnings, and GM's EPS would have been lower, not higher, than the target EPS by between 43 and 100%. This would have killed the financial results section in the CEO bonus, so this clearly incentivizes making few EVs. Let's now check B, strategic goals, where the bonus was paid for GMs. Launching the Hummer EV and BrightDrop Zevo 600 delivery van, increasing its market share in the electric vehicle market, and generating $10 billion in net income. As we saw, making 500,000 EVs would have cost GM roughly $5 to $10 billion, dropping GM's net income to between $5 billion and $0. This would kill the bonus for exceeding $10 billion net income, so this too incentivizes making fewer EVs. Also, we finally know why GM delivered a single Hummer EV in the last week of 2021. Had GM delivered it a few months later when the first batch of cars was ready for delivery, GM would have been a few $1 million richer, but its CEO respectively poorer. I wonder how the board approved giving millions of dollars in bonus for rushing out that single car. No, I don't, considering who the chair of the board is. GM has now delivered 18 Silverado EVs, after which they delayed production of the truck until late 2025. I wonder how much bonus Mary Barra will get for delivering these half-baked trucks 2 years before starting production. But the bonus is just the beginning because 50% of CEO compensation is via direct stock awards. This would have been fine had the CEO held on to the stocks like Elon did until the last 2 years, but Mary sells. As can be seen here, every year Ms. Barra sells shares in high quantities, and having her salary paid through shares, which she promptly sells, creates a tremendous incentive to focus on short-term performance and maintaining stock price, rather than thinking long-term. Producing 500,000 EVs or more would be great for GM's future, but the resultant low or negative earnings would be punished by the short-term driven market. A lower share price would reduce CEO compensation from stock sales, so short-term it is. The final part of GM's executive compensation provides 17% as stock options. At least this should incentivize taking a long-term approach, right? Well, I thought so too. Only it's wrong because after so many years on the job, Ms. Barra constantly has options maturing, which she then sells. And these previous options also incentivize boosting current stock price at all costs. With 67% of CEO compensation directly dependent on short-term stock price, pumping the price takes extra importance. Had this been limited to creating hype on media appearances, I wouldn't have cared, only this goes much deeper. It could be argued that GM's decision to attack all fronts with a full lineup instead of going one model at a time and benefiting from economies of scale like Tesla does was meant to create media hype and pump the stock. Plans to make 20 to 30 models and overtake Tesla raised stock price much more than making 2 or 3 slow-selling models. And with GM's incentive structure, it could very well be that GM's stock-selling management chose to ride the hype train and pump the stock instead of suffering short-term dips as they're building a stronger, more successful company. Overtaking Tesla with 25 models.
Do you think that you can catch Tesla by 2025?
Absolutely, Phil.
I never thought I'd say this, but GM truly is a story stock. That being said, I do think the main reason for planning so many models was GM's inexperience in EVs, and their hubris of thinking that EVs are like ICE cars, and we know how to ramp production. Listen to this interview from 2020 with GM President Mark Royce.
Mark, on paper, nobody's arguing that this doesn't make sense, that General Motors does not have the assets and the will to do better and to do much better when it comes to electric vehicles. But you know, and we've talked about this before, you've been talking about this and laying the groundwork for some time. Why should investors believe that GM truly has the horses to catch up and pass Tesla?
Well, I think if you look at the synergy that we have across the company, we make internal combustion engines, 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 we have world-class manufacturing, you know that. You look at our launches that we've done over the last few years, and they've been very, very good. So that industrial might and will and scale globally is something that we're bringing to bear in the electric vehicle space.
He goes on talking about,
we're going to have to show people, and we will. And doing what we say we're going to do is everything, and we will do that.
It seems to me like GM's management really thought they had it all figured out. They had no real experience making EVs, and they still thought of themselves as an internal combustion company. But so what? Thinking with hubris, this only told them that they know how to produce cars and that their industrial might combined with their modular platform would crush Tesla's sales. Chapter 2. Subsidies and Loans. Ill-aligned incentives are bad, but it would be less of a problem had they been limited to company funds. Unfortunately, they are not, as lots of public money is involved. In the next section, we'll see how public funds are quietly diverted to shareholder pockets, but let's first understand how much money is at stake. Let's hear what Mary Barra has to say.
Let me ask you about political funding. Following the January 6th riots on Capitol Hill, GM was one of the many corporations that put a pause on political funding. But you have restarted that funding, and in some cases have made donations to some of the Republican members of Congress who had voted against certifying the Biden election. Can you explain that decision?
So we look at, we don't agree with everyone. You know, we give it to both parties, right. And we don't necessarily, a PAC donation is not necessarily an endorsement of every single thing that person has done. And so we do look on balance, we added additional requirements of what we're looking for since that time. And, you know, we'll stand behind the decisions. We have a committee that looks at this, cross-functional, it's debated. And we think it's also important, though, at times to have that influence. And so we'll continue to be very measured and make sure we're also, as we go forward, consistent with our values.
What do you think of not spending any money in Washington? Would you ever say to yourself, you know what, I mean, here you are, and you're going to be running the business roundtable, but what do you think of the idea of just saying, you know what, let's get money out of this, we're not going to do it?
I think those are easy things to say. The unintended consequences and how it really turns out, I think, are what most people don't understand. Believe me, we've had those discussions at General Motors.
And what's the...
Well, we on balance made the decision that in a very measured way, looking at what we do consistent with our values, we thought it was in the best interest for the company, right. And for our all of our stakeholders that we have a voice.
GM donates to campaigns on both sides of the aisle, as they think it's important to have influence over American laws, and that it's in the best interest of the company that they have a voice. I assume that they used this voice to push hard for the preemptive bailout that later became the IRA, the same way as they were the force behind the $7,500 EV tax credit that was in place before the IRA. However, while their involvement in the previous tax credit is well known, I cannot prove anything regarding the IRA. And since all EV makers benefit from it, let's put the IRA aside and focus on subsidies specific for GM. In 2021, GM had a $10 billion income, so clearly it could fund its own business. Yet in the USA alone, GM collected over $125 million in subsidies. Why? If you think everybody does this, think again. In 2021, Tesla didn't take a single cent in subsidies, and neither did Ford. But $125 million is chump change, because in 2022, GM had a similar income of $9.7 billion. Yet it took almost $1.8 billion in subsidies, as well as a $2.5 billion loan for its Ultium JV. Again, Tesla took nothing, and neither did Ford. And that's despite Ford having a net loss. Why does a public company with a profit of $10 billion need $4.3 billion of taxpayer funds? Following previous reasoning, one might think that without these subsidies, profits would be lower, and the CEO wouldn't be eligible for that hefty $6 million bonus. Technically, that's true, but unlike other items we saw which worked against GM's long-term viability, getting funds to invest in the future could help the company. So let's drop the question of why GM wanted funding and instead check what they did with the money. Chapter 3. Preparing for Bailout. Once COVID hit, GM stopped paying dividends. But in mid-2022, headlines all over financial media announced that GM has decided to reinstate dividends, albeit at a lower level of around $750 million per year. What didn't make headlines, and in fact was rarely discussed, was another GM decision to up their share buyback program to $5 billion. Sometimes it's hard to grasp the meaning of numbers when they're large. So $5 billion out of GM's $156 billion revenue doesn't sound like much. But $5 billion is 10% of GM's total valuation. So it's like Tesla spending $81 billion to buy back stocks. Think about that for a moment. It's not just talk, by the way. In the 4 quarters since their announcement, GM has already taken more than $4 billion from the company's coffers and gave them to shareholders. Why would they do that? One answer is that dividends keep the stock price afloat, and a 10% buyback pumps the stock. And this brings us back to the agency problem and to GM CEO's constant selling. Chapter 4. The immorality of it all. Unfortunately, pumping the stock is the small part. The main part, in my opinion, is that GM is preparing for another bailout. First, call me a prune, but when a company, any company, takes $1.8 billion in subsidies and then gives them to its shareholders, I see that as immoral. But when that company is facing an admittedly turbulent future, which could bankrupt them, and to battle this future, it's also taking billions of dollars of taxpayer-funded loans, while at the same time giving billions and billions of dollars to shareholders. I ask myself, who will pay back these loans? If you're an American taxpayer, there's a good chance it's you.
The number one thing you have to do as a car company to survive in the near term against any kind of exogenous shock is make sure you have all the cash you need. Look, it's the only reason Ford never went bankrupt. Because in 2008, GM and Chrysler did. The Ford family was wise enough to tell the CEO, raise all the cash you can. And that's why Ford is still a public company.
GM faces an enormous task of moving from 98% internal combustion engines to 100% EV. They'll face huge problems developing and adopting new technologies, closing factories, retraining, and mostly replacing employees. They'll have union problems, supplier problems, dealer problems. They'll face intense competition from Chinese OEMs. They'll have a huge cost disadvantage compared to newer and more advanced cars. They'll need to be agile and smart and spend billions and billions of dollars to even stand a chance of achieving all this, yet they're giving away money now like there's no tomorrow. Maybe it's because they know there's no tomorrow. Maybe that's the reason that GM CEO Mary Barra and GM President Mark Royce sold in the last 3 years alone more shares than they still hold. A basic aspect of Adam Smith capitalism is that failing companies should not be saved, because doing so rewards bad behavior, and there's no better example of that than GM. In the years preceding the bailout, GM underinvested in factories, models, and technology while taking huge subsidies from governments all over the world. In the years preceding the bailout, they took tens of billions of dollars from the company's war chest and gave them to shareholders. And when hard times arrived, it were taxpayers that paid the bills. I don't think it was intentional back then, as most of this happened in good times before hardships were expected, but the company failed and was bailed out with extremely good terms, and GM's current management learned a lesson. The question is which one? I'm long disillusioned by GM, so I'll leave this question to you. Consider the following. During the previous hardships, taxpayers paid GM's bills. Hardships are now in plain sight. GM is taking billions in subsidies and public loans, while funneling billions out to its shareholders. And while all this is happening, GM's top management are selling shares as fast as they can get them. Hanlon's razor says that we should never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. So let me know in the answers below. Are GM's managers the stupid ones, or we? A huge thank you to my producer-level patron, Katrin, for asking me to check into GM again. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe. Consider supporting me on Patreon for as little as $1 a month or as high as you wish. Your support really helps me make these deep dive videos, and I'll also send you my patron-only newsletter. You can also support the channel by sharing this video on social media. Please follow me on X, where I am connecting no dots. Until next time, I am connecting the dots, and you are amazing. Twitter is becoming the place to be, so I invite you to follow me there. I'm connecting no dots. I tweet several times a day with everything from long threads analyzing Tesla matters to making memes and hanging out with you guys. So, see you there. Until next time, I am connecting the dots, and you are amazing.